Shadiverse.
Greetings, I'm Shad, and I want to talk about a subject that is often reviewed, thought about, and discussed in the medieval community, and that is the limits of medieval armor. At what point would you be able to break through it? A lot of times when we talk about medieval armor, it very much depends on context as to what type, because depending on the type will then depend on how easy it is to overcome it. One of the easiest ways is to avoid the armor, hit them where the armor is not located. And in terms of difficulty in getting in the gaps, there's a discussion there. Specifically, what I want to focus on is actually when you strike the armor and can penetrate it. That's the part where it takes a lot of nuance and a lot of parts to consider. The thing that's triggered this discussion, this video that I want to talk about with you, is Todd from Todd's Workshop has a project he is kickstarting at the moment where it's a part 2 of his phenomenal video on arrows versus armor. I think this is a tremendous project. I definitely am going to support it, and I think it would be awesome if you guys would like to support it too, so he can reach the stretch goals and actually give us even more information as to how strong medieval armor is in important contexts that need to be considered, because this is one of the things that why he wants to do a part 2. The first video very much was a specific poundage of bow, so an arrow shot by, I think it was like a 160-pound bow, hitting flat on chest medieval breastplate. But there's so much nuance to consider in that regard. One, it's the poundage of bow and how representative that poundage of bow is for what might have been common on the medieval battlefield. The next one is the type of metal. In the first test that Todd did, the metal was medium carbon steel from memory. It was medium carbon steel that was not hardened or tempered. It was normalized, room-cooled, medium carbon steel that was based off of an actual surviving piece. This is really important because that was not the best steel quality you could get in the medieval period, but it also wasn't the worst. So the discussion in how easy is it to overcome armor generally, it's a complex thing, but the more tests that we can do, the more insight we can get as to how effective it would be based on the type of attack, where the attack lands. Again, so Todd wants to do in this follow-up video, this kind of part 2, is shoot on thinner parts of the armor on the sides, but also test it against helmets. This is going to be a great thing to see. So really, if you guys want to support it, I encourage you to. As I mentioned, I'm supporting it, and I can't wait to see the results. So I'll put a link to the Kickstarter and I want to discuss a little bit more on the reality or problems, complexities, nuance even, that we need to consider when even thinking about this subject. So beginning on the lower types of armor, here's some of the things that need to be considered when you are doing tests that I'm confident Todd is going to be taking into account in his tests, and he has done it in the past, and things that I try and be mindful as well. So, can a sword pierce Gambeson? We'll start at the lower grades of armor, and also looking at, could an arrow pierce Gambeson? Saying the question as simplistic as that leaves out a lot of important stuff. For instance, how thick is the Gambeson? Gambesons can sometimes... So Gambeson is usually layered textile armor, most often linen, but it wasn't always linen. Sometimes it was layers of linen, sometimes it was linen and then wool sandwiched in between, and then linen on top. Sometimes there was multiple layers of a few layers of linen, then wool, then a few layers on top of that. Sometimes it was hardened in some ways, like I think Todd even did a video, I think, once, looking at Gambeson that was soaked in wine. And so there are a lot of different variants and types of even Gambeson armor that would give different results. And so saying, yes, a arrow could always pierce Gambeson or a sword could always pierce Gambeson is far too simplistic, because what type of Gambeson? What type of arrow? This is really important. You have bodkins, you have broadheads, you have plate cutters, you have all these different types. A plate cutter arrowhead would actually not be as effective as getting through Gambeson as a bodkin would. Broadheads behave differently on textile armor as they do metal armor. These are all, again, complex things. In regards to swords in Gambeson, it is very much how sharp the sword is. Even a very sharp sword can have trouble cutting through one layer of linen. But there's actually a difference between very sharp and crazy sharp. Like, more than shaving sharp. And when you get a sword or a blade that sharp, the difference in results is actually shocking. Scarlegrim has tested this where he got like a crazy sharp sword, and that was able to chop through several, even nearly all layers, like a 30-layered Gambeson, chop through it all. And then he's also done tests where he has a sharp sword, like a sword that can cut through a tatami mat and wood, but it wasn't crazy sharp, and it didn't even get through the top layer of Gambeson. We can get results as like hugely different. That is a massive, vast difference in results for a change that people might not think is that, like, difference between really sharp and super sharp. You can get shockingly different results. One that I think is really, really important, and I don't know if Todd will end up watching this, but one that my own kind of request, maybe it could be a stretch goal depending on how far he can push the Kickstarter, and I hope it gets, you know, all the stretch goals, is doing tests with different poundage of bow. Something that I think is really important is in any test with a bow is getting, say, like different poundages, even with like, you have to do different arrowheads, but even on the same arrowhead. So, all right, we're using a bodkin here. I think it's important to actually test out that same type of bodkin with different poundage of arrows, because it is debated as to what the standard poundage of the medieval warbow was. I've seen the argument when people raise it with me, and I've seen people giving references, and sometimes they feel the Mary Rose bows should be considered in the analysis, but some people say they shouldn't be because they're technically not in the medieval period. Some people say they're not too far removed, they're representative. And so as a result, the standard poundage or draw weight of bows is very debated still, even in the communities that love and dive into the research. And my own opinion at the moment, it basically comes to, okay, the standard warbow range of bows is anything from 100 to 200 pounds, but from that, I feel we should extrapolate what the extremes are then. I feel, yes, we have examples of 200-pound draw weight warbows that, you know, can be justified to be representative of the medieval period, even if they don't come exactly from it, like the Mary Rose ones. But then how common would that be? I feel that would be the upper extreme. And just by what we know from human biomechanics and stuff, it is easier to reach the lower end of the warbow range than the higher ends. And so we can logically conclude then that there would be more warbow archers shooting in the lower end of the warbow ranges than the higher end. And so I feel there would be more people shooting at, say, 120 pounds versus maybe not 200, like versus 160 pounds. Todd gets Joe Gibbs, who can shoot 200 pounds and can comfortably shoot 160 pounds to take part in the test, which is, I think, brilliant. But again, I don't think we should take the results as universally applicable for everything, because it's very likely that there was a lot of warbow archers that were shooting even lower. I think you could definitely take the results if you cannot penetrate armor with a 160-pound bow with this type of arrow, you wouldn't be able to penetrate it with a lower poundage bow. So I think the higher poundage tests, so when you use a high poundage bow in these tests, that is actually a representative result for the lower poundage. The issue is when you start to penetrate. And so if you were easily penetrating certain types of armor with a 160-pound bow, we can't then extrapolate that and say, and this is including on Gambeson. So say, again, because we started looking at Gambeson, say you're able to penetrate even 30-layer Gambeson with a 160-pound bow. That's really great information to know, but is that representative of a 120-pound bow? Sometimes when people see tests like this, they just think, medieval longbow will just be able to beat Gambeson. Again, applying it too broadly, there's more nuance. I loved Todd's tests with his lockdown longbow. So he has a crossbow that can shoot an arrow at the same speed that Joe Gibbs was able to shoot with his 160-pound medieval longbow. And so he was able to shoot medieval, authentic arrows, so they're recreations, of course, at shields, and there was some pretty surprising penetration with that. So that's really cool information. Of course, things need to be considered as to thickness of the shield, what is layered on top, is it layered with linen, glue linen, or rawhide, or any number of things can vary. But if it's penetrating with the higher poundage, one of the things that I would love to then know is, okay, what's the level in which it isn't penetrating as deep or just stops penetrating? We could go down to, 140, 120, 100 pound and seeing which one, because this would give us a clearer picture or an idea. And it's not, when it's a clear picture, it's not like a one-to-one, because there are so many things. Are we using the same, is the wood we're using the same density of wood that they used back then? So there's a lot of complexity, but it at least gives us a guidance, an idea of, what could have been like in the period to, what level or strength of bow, high chances of penetrating shields and armor and all those things. And so all the things that we kind of discussed with Gambeson, guess what, applies with mail, chainmail as well. There's a lot of tests that show chainmail particularly strong at resisting cuts. But again, what type of chainmail? Are we dealing with riveted mail or butted mail? How thick are the rings? What type of steel? What type of arrow? How much is the poundage of the bow? How sharp is the sword? How much of a taper is on the sword? These are all things that need to be considered when we are trying to test what the past might have been like with as accurate representations as we can. When we're looking at how easy it is to kind of bypass or overcome someone wearing armor, again, how much does the armor actually cover? Because we have many examples of hauberks stopping, at the sleeves or going all the way down onto the arms. Does it cover the legs? And again, if the arms are exposed and the legs are exposed, you would try and hit those areas because they're unarmored more often in combat, if the opportunity presents itself, than just going hard and penetrating the armor. And when it comes to penetrating mail, thrusts are the easiest way to penetrate mail that we do have from many tests. But there are sometimes cases which you could cut through mail, depending on the type of mail, depending on the type of weapon. An axe, for instance, has a much higher chance of splitting apart rings in a cut than, say, a sword. Then we're going to move on to plate. Now, before we move on to plate, I want to add an additional point of clarification as to why I'm doing this. The medieval period is adapted into many things: fantasy, film, and even if the film is a fantasy film, or it's a historical one, it's tests like this that hopefully will give people a guidance, an understanding of how armor works, how we can overcome it. And one of the things that I love doing is taking my knowledge of the medieval period, how the weapons and armor work, and apply it to role-playing games. When I'm playing D&D or my own version, Cogent Roleplay, but in any medieval setting, understanding small points of nuance like this that might give me an advantage or disadvantage in the context of the game we're playing. It adds to the immersion. And because there's a lot of aspiring writers who watch this channel, but also people who love role-playing games and just who love the medieval period generally, I think it's great just understanding as much nuance to the subject as we can to get a much clearer picture. So plate armor is one that has so much nuance to try and figure out. Again, the level of plate, is it a combination between brigandine, say a brigandine cuirass, and pauldrons or braces, gauntlets, any number of, there's a lot of different ways to combine, and different types of even plate armor actually behave very differently against, different types of weapons. And there's also different qualities in regards to these different types. Brigandine is a really interesting type of armor when compared to plate armor because it's made up of smaller plate segments, but sometimes these smaller plate segments actually have different grades of steel in between the segmented plates. It's possible that even on a plate harness that there might be different grades of steel between the pieces on the harness, between the breastplate and the gauntlet, say, or the braces or the pauldrons. This would all give varying results. And then armor pieces, of course, have different thicknesses. So Todd is going to be exploring some really important things in his tests. One of the things that he wants to test is shooting on the side of a plate, breastplate, and shooting at a helmet. Something he's really excited to. So he has a video talking about what he intends for these tests. And he's right to be excited because the thing he's excited about will be really, really great to see. And it's the fragmentation pattern or what kind of happens when these arrows hit the type of visored bassinet that they want to test against. So they're doing one that's seems to be made far more so in deflecting arrows. And seeing how these arrows will deflect and fragment is going to be really, really interesting. I want to know the answers to this, just so I could incorporate it into the novels that I want to write, because I'd love to incorporate these realistic elements. And so seeing this in slow motion is going to be phenomenal. Once again, I highly recommend and I encourage you guys to support his project at $1, whatever you can afford, $10, because this is the type of stuff that helps us understand the things we love even more, the medieval period. And so I'm excited for that. And I'll reiterate again, one of the things that I'd really love to see, if he does get penetration on a 160-pound bow, I would love to see where that penetration ceases going down in poundage. Because, as I mentioned, if this armor can deflect an arrow shot from a 160-pound bow, most likely it'll also be able to deflect and prevent any type of arrow shot in lower poundage. But if it can't, if they get penetration, I would love to see what is the poundage then that stops that penetration. So maybe a stretch goal, Todd. It would be awesome. Some of the nuanced things that we got to see in his first test was, for instance, having a type of linen covering over the armor. This was done a lot, more so than a lot of people realize in the medieval period, that they wore textiles over their metal armor, sometimes as an additional layer of armor. It was actually layered, Gambeson-like armor if it was a jupon or something like that. But other times it was also just for fashion. But even if it was for fashion, it would have a really interesting result on the fragmentation that we were seeing in the arrows shot in Todd's first test. There was a high chance that when the arrow hit the flat breastplate, that the arrowhead would snap and shoot upwards. But the breastplate has this V on it, which helps deflect it. What they also saw in the test, and this is probably one of my favorite parts of this first test he did, was where they put a jupon over top of the armor. And the arrow that got shot in, the jupon, this layer of material nearly stopped all the fragmentation, the dangerous fragmentation, because it just hit the material and got caught and got stuck. That is brilliant to know. What an awesome thing. And now I can mention it because it's a bit of nuance to understand when you're trying to depict armor correctly. What levels does it take to overcome the armor? Well, if they're wearing textile over top, now the fragmentation from arrow shots is something that really helps against. What is the type of armor between the gaps? And then you can combine the knowledge, because in a lot of instances, there was an arming double underneath that had mail covering, the armpit and the vulnerable areas. And so if you have mail and a level of, textile, this could be Gambeson, it depends on the layers of Gambeson as well, you can then apply your understanding of how easy it is to overcome mail to those joints as well. All things that really should be considered when you're looking at medieval armor, and how effective is it really? How easy is it to overcome? Sometimes that's getting around the armor, as I mentioned. Sometimes that's just busting through it. I don't have too many references to kind of get a good bead or understanding on how easy it is to cut through plate armor with a bladed weapon. It's almost impossible with a sword, but this would very much depend on the quality of armor. If the armor is hardened steel, good carbon content, hardened steel, it's almost impossible to chop through with a sword. But what if we're dealing with mild steel or softer steel? It'd still be very hard, based on my understanding, but there's not many tests on this. An axe, for instance, could have much higher chances. A pole axe, especially, or a Bector Corbin, the spike. How easy is for a spike to penetrate certain types of armor, the thickness of the armor, the grade of the armor. These are all additional things that I know I could do with more nuance on. And it goes just back into the thing I'm mentioning of how valuable Todd's project is, that we're going to get far more information on arrows, specifically against plate armor in this instance. And those are some of the main things I wanted to mention to try and keep in mind when you're analyzing, adapting, using medieval armor in whatever context it is, the nuances that you should try and be aware of and take account of when you're got, for instance, like the hero moment, when the hero might want to do this epic big swing and it actually goes through the armor. I get so frustrated in so many movies where anyone can just chop through armor. It was like nothing. But what is the level in which you might get away with it? What if it needs to be a lance from horseback? What strength do you need to put behind a poleaxe to get through a certain type of medieval breastplate? All these things, great to know. Todd's helping us out, so do support the project if you want. And I hope I've been able to add a bit more nuance to just the analysis of how good is medieval armor and hopefully that'll be able to help you out in some way as well. I hope you've enjoyed, and of course hope to see you on the next video here on Shadiversity. So and also I hope you do support Todd's project as well. Thank you for watching, and until next time, farewell.